The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. Martin Luther King, Jr. It's 2025, and it's time for science. One of the sponsors of this podcast, the Full Option Science System, or FOSS, was awarded a design review badge by Johns Hopkins University. We talked with Dr. Stephen Ross and Dr. Alan Reid from Johns Hopkins about that whole rigorous process and why any curriculum in general should be reviewed and certified by experts. Then we go right to the source of FOSS itself, co-founder and director of FOSS, Linda De Lucchi. Linda has developed instructional materials in K-8 science education, environmental education, health education, and special education for 50 years at the Lawrence Hall of Science. We talk about the history of FOSS, going back to its very beginnings many years ago at the Lawrence Hall of Science, its foundations in work with students with visual impairments, and the discovery that whenever a tool for students with disabilities worked, it ended up being the right tool for all students. And then we talk about what Linda would like to see in the future for elementary science education. Well, it's time for science, and it is time to talk about curriculum design review. It's important for teachers, schools, and districts to know that whatever curriculum in any subject they teach meets important standards of quality and passes strict educational reviews so that the needs of their students are being met in the best possible way. And I am very honored and pleased to have two senior researchers at the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins University here with me today to talk about this very subject. Dr. Stephen Ross and Dr. Alan Reid are here to talk broadly about the curriculum design review and what it is, and what it means to educators, and specifically about the FOSS Science Pathways curriculum, which they recently awarded the Johns Hopkins Instructional Review Badge. Based on the Instructional Design Review, it's been determined that FOSS satisfies the criteria for meeting Tier 4 of the ESSA Tiers of Evidence, which we are going to talk about. So let's dive right into this world of curriculum design review. Dr. Ross, Dr. Reid, welcome to our show.
Great to be here, Tom.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk more generally to frame the discussion, and Alan will talk more specifically about this particular project. Curriculum design is extremely important for schools today, especially given the changing world we're in with AI, artificial intelligence, technology being used. Curricula that once were set in textbooks and used for many, many years are constantly changing. Yet curriculum developers, publishers, are being asked by federal law to be able to provide evidence of the efficacy of their curricula and also of their programs. So given that pressure, we at the Center for Research and Reform in Education try to support members of the publishing industry to help them evaluate their own curricula, but also, most importantly, develop curricula that are scientifically based and that they can refine over time. So one of the services we offer is to do a design review. Our design review, as Alan will talk about in more detail, is not saying they're teaching the right content necessarily in math or science or social emotional learning or reading, but that their approach is well grounded in industry standards for instructional design, meaning there's objectives that are viable, ways of supporting the user, a theoretical model, and so on. And being able to establish that is very important to the publisher because the Every Student Succeeds Act has 4 tiers of evidence. And without getting into too much detail, there are very high levels of evidence that show where student achievement is enhanced. And this is not what design reviews are about. But just very quickly, where student achievement is shown to be increased by a rigorous study that uses a randomized design, that is called Tier 1. Where a rigorous study is done that doesn't use a randomized design, but has teachers volunteer to try a curriculum, others use a different curriculum, but it's a rigorous study, that's called Tier 2. Where there's a smaller study that shows achievement gains, that's called Tier 3. And that, by the way, is promising evidence, and the higher levels are moderate and strong evidence. But for publishers, the starting point is to show that they have good foundational basis for that curriculum. And what Alan's team does is to look at the curriculum from that perspective and ensure that what they're showing meets those criteria. So I'll turn it over to Alan because this is much more understandable through a concrete application that he'll describe.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm sure we're going to bring you back in for various things, but Dr. Alan Reid, let's talk a little bit about the actual process, maybe not specifically about the FOSS stuff just yet, but the process itself. How does it begin, and what is your role, and how does it unfold?
Sure. So typically a client or a sponsor would come to the center seeking some type of evidence. So the reason they would want evidence for ESSA ranges, but essentially it's a type of certification or a really accreditation for school districts and schools to be able to validate the program or the product or the curriculum. We also have sponsors who use the tier evidence to include in federal grant proposals and things like that. And so they come to our center seeking this different tiered evidence. I am in charge of the Tier 4 evidence in the Center for Research and Reform, which means we look specifically at two things. We look at research-informed logic models. So if a client already has one of those, we revisit and refine those. And if they don't have one, we collaborate with the client on developing one together. And the second thing is a planned research study. So that would be the design and development of the research methodology, the research questions, the outcomes, and different types of things that we would look at potentially for an efficacy study. And that's kind of how it works.
So turning to the FOSS Pathways program, what was it that sort of made the program pass or stand out in this category?
Yeah, so when we do the instructional design reviews, we apply an evaluation rubric that we created in the center years ago now. I think maybe 10 years back, we created the evaluation rubric. And then we apply various aspects from other rubrics, one of them being the Watson and Anstey rubric for e-learning tools. And so we use this criteria to essentially judge the different program aspects. And specifically for FOSS Pathways, we were looking at the story of the development of the program. So we look at where did it all begin? What's it rooted in theoretically, programmatically, research? FOSS came to us already having a pretty well-developed logic model in place. So that was really helpful. But then we look at other categories and criteria that, range, as Steve referred to, different instructional design features like instructional sequencing, alignment with objectives, feedback, assessment. And then we look at more tangible design related things like actual interfaces, compatibility, accessibility, those things.
The report states that there are areas, things like program design clearly specifies a systematic theory of action, and there's something about multicultural and diverse perspective. Is there anything that you particularly feel is sort of the most important, or the metrics that you think are the most important for programs to match?
It's hard. And actually, I'll say that evaluation rubric initially began with a sort of weighted system, like a point system. So for each of the criterion, we were assigning values and points, and then tallying up those points in the end, and then sort of assigning different levels of, how they met the different levels from that rubric. And we've since gotten away from that because it is sort of difficult to really compare the different criteria. I mean, we have broader categories that we look at, like program design and framework, feedback, program evaluation, materials interface design, these different things. It's difficult to sort of put one over the other. And definitely programs and products shine in different ways. I'll say a lot of people come to the center not really having conducted proper or formal evaluations, and have instead collected more informal formative evaluation data from things like surveys and talking to users anecdotally. So those are some of the things that we look for in these products.
Our audience is generally educators, teachers from elementary especially. You had mentioned various efficacy studies that Johns Hopkins conducts of program impacts. Are there ways that those studies tie into the review process?
Those particular studies, I mean, if they've been done, they would certainly help Alan in his review of the design to know there's been an efficacy study. They're a little bit separate, though. One can move the needle on student achievement and still have a curriculum or a program that has some flaws in it. So Alan is really looking at the gestalt, the big picture, as well as particular criteria. So it's nice that a particular program moves the needle on achievement. But could it be better? Is it still missing some things? And so that's what his review is really about. Usually the sequence is to go from as Alan mentioned, is to go from the design review, tier 4, and say, hey, you're ready for prime time. Here are some things you can do to make things better, to make it more amenable to what teachers would need and students would need. Now let's see how it works in terms of whether it yields greater achievement effects. Because school districts and teachers that are listening, obviously, above everything else, want student achievement to improve. That's what it's all about.
Anything to add to that, Dr. Reid?
No, I think for the tier 4 evidence, which is, again, that's really sort of my specialization. The requirements are not terribly stringent. Again, they really need to meet 2 criteria. They have to have a research-informed logic model, and they have to have a planned research study in place. So that doesn't mean that it has to have been conducted just yet, but it's always helpful when clients come to us and show us some other type of study or work that they've already completed that we can build on. And a lot of times we talk about the evidence for ESSA in terms of building a portfolio. And what we mean by that is we typically will start with that tier 4. We'll look at a design review. We might perform an instructional design review. And in some cases, we might do what we call a tier 4+, which is a sort of detailed case study where we're administering surveys and collecting formative feedback that way. And then from there, we move into ideally a tier 3 or a tier 2 study. And then we can build on these different tiers to sort of round out this portfolio for each of the clients.
With the world of education is like ever changing, as I'm sure you're well aware of, just new standards, new things happen all the time. It must be difficult to keep up on that kind of thing. But this must be a kind of a living thing for you, that it has to change with time. Or what kind of challenges are those as education evolves over time that you guys have to keep up with?
I would say the challenge is more for the teachers and administrators, the school leaders that may be listening in the sense that they continually have to adjust to not only state policies that are constantly changing, but also to national policies involving class size, involving how many minutes of exposure. Certainly nowadays, different states have different types of scrutiny over what can be taught. Parent groups come into the fray in terms of what they feel is appropriate. So there's a lot of pressures on educators today, but they're doing a good job and we all appreciate it. For us, it's a matter of helping them. So if there's a change in policy, that means there's going to be a change in curriculum. We want to review that curriculum and say it seems ready for prime time at Tier 4. And if it's actually used in classrooms or when it's used, we want to be there to say, here's the efficacy. Here's what, and our studies aren't just looking at student achievement. They're looking at teacher experiences. So our studies are both quantitative, looking at achievement gains, but they're also qualitative. What do teachers say about it? And obviously, the design review would have a lot to do with what teachers would say about it, because teachers want to make sure that that curricula is ready to be used and that they have the objectives clearly stated, the sequencing, as Alan mentioned, and the support. So all this works together. It's not tough for us. The pressure is on the schools, and we want to be there to help.
Dr. Reid, anything to add?
No, I think Steve really encapsulated. I think, we're here as a resource for educators and for school districts and other stakeholders. It's not, I think our job is relatively easy compared to what modern teachers have to do and keep up with in the classroom. And we recognize that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges and barriers that we experience in our center is sometimes having to convince teachers in schools and school districts and administrations how valuable these reviews and studies can be, not just for the program and product or the client themselves, but for the actual school and for the students. And so that's something that we come across every now and then.
I want to wrap it up with basically saying, Pathways got this badge, and it's from Johns Hopkins, one of the most prestigious universities ever. And it's a wonderful thing to have as a little kudo for the thing. But what do you want it to represent? I figure the two of you, when you guys put your badge on and say, yes, this passed, what are you hoping teachers can look at and can feel comfortable and secure in knowing that it's been through this process? What do you want to put out there, Dr. Ross? What is your philosophy about that part?
Yeah, I mean, I'll deal with it more generally in terms of what my goals would be as a center director and in general. Alan probably has somewhat more specific goals because his background is in instructional design, and he takes that field very seriously, as we all do. We definitely, the Johns Hopkins certification is not necessarily saying that there's no need for improvement, that this is a perfect curriculum or program, but it says that it's been vetted by a third party that's experienced in quality programs, experienced in instructional design. So it's gotten through the first gate. This is not like the seal of good housekeeping, but again, it's been looked at, it's been vetted. But at the same token, once it's used, we also want to hear, how is it feeling for you as a teacher, as a school? And secondly, is it moving the needle on student achievement relative to alternative programs? So that's our goal. But Alan, I'm sure, has some goals as an instructional design specialist.
So Alan, what does it mean to you when the badge is awarded?
Well, I would second everything that Steve just said. And we do have internal conversations about what does it mean? What does the badge mean? And we do want to stay away from it meaning a certain type of endorsement, or as Steve likes to say, the seal of good housekeeping. Instead, it's a sort of bond of trust, or it's a sort of validation or recognition that these things exist in this program, product, curriculum that have been vetted by people who have expertise in these specific areas. And working with Tier 4 products and services, I always like to encourage clients to move on to the next level. So it's not always enough just to get that instructional design review badge or curriculum review badge or anything like that. It's more about taking that first step and then moving into a much more rigorous study where we can look at the actual effects of that intervention.
Thank you both for being here very much. It's really exciting to talk to you about this because I think it's super important that not only the FOSS stuff, but in general, teachers can feel very confident in the curriculum they're teaching, and you're doing a wonderful job. So thank you, both of you, for being here. Well, it's time for science, and it is time to talk to FOSS Science's very own Linda De Lucchi. Linda is the founder and co-director of the Full Option Science System project, which is FOSS. She has developed instructional materials in K-8 science education, environmental education, health education, and special education for 45 years at the Lawrence Hall of Science. In addition to curriculum development, Ms. De Lucchi has directed numerous teacher preparation projects, has provided many tens of thousands of teacher hours in science education, in service at the site level, district level, and national leadership level throughout the country and abroad. So we're going to chat more about the Johns Hopkins Instructional Review Badge that we just talked about, and the founding and philosophy of FOSS Science, and talk about the importance of research-based curriculums and the future of science education. So Linda, thank you for coming on the show.
Glad to be here.
So the beginning is always a good place to begin. We're going to talk about the doctors Reid and Ross mentioned FOSS's very strong logic model that it was based on right from the very beginning. So that was a huge help for them when they did this badge. So let's talk about the foundation of FOSS. How did it come about? How did the idea start with you?
The idea started here at the Lawrence Hall of Science, which is part of the University of California, Berkeley, many years ago, with a variety of projects. At that time, when I first joined the hall, a pioneering project here at the Lawrence was the Science Curriculum Improvement Study project funded by NSF, which kind of was one of the few projects nationally that reacted to a nation at risk. And at that time, the National Science Foundation was funding projects to improve the pipeline through education to make sure that we had a good balance of scientists to further the national goals. So that's kind of the milieu that it was working in. When I joined the hall in the 70s, there were a number of projects that were going on, and one of the projects that I joined was a project to bring science to elementary school students with disabilities. And the first disability that we worked with was children who had visual impairments. We worked with blind students, we worked with low vision students, and we worked with them in the settings that they were found. We worked at the California School for the Blind, which was just down the hill from us here at the hall. We also worked in resource rooms. Often students with disabilities were in resource rooms and rarely in the regular classroom. So that was a time when the idea of full inclusion, or what was called mainstreaming there, to make sure that all students were working together with the same kind of materials. Everyone had the opportunity to learn. So that's what we did. We developed materials for upper elementary age students that would allow them to make discoveries about in science, working with tools. So we had to develop measurement tools that blind students could work with. We developed a balance. And whenever we developed something for a student with a disability, it turned out to be a very good tool for all students. It helped them. So that was kind of our approach. We called our work the Center for Multisensory Learning. And we were trying to provide access to science at an early age for all students. That was before we had a Department of Education. It was a project that was funded at the federal level, but in a different branch. And it gave us an opportunity to explore this kind of hands-on science or active learning science with students with disabilities. And it also allowed us to work with teachers of students with disabilities, special education teachers, and help them to mainstream their students, bring them into the regular classroom. So our goal was to provide tools for all students to learn together collaboratively. We kind of took the asset approach, that we worked with the skills and the tools that would allow the students to learn by doing. and it was very successful. During that time, we had the opportunity to work with regular and special education teachers, and they told us that the materials that they were using should be for all students, shouldn't be just for special ed teachers working in mainstream classrooms. So that's how the whole idea began. It really began with us working in the field and them telling us that this approach should be available for all teachers in all classrooms. So we, working with our team here at the Hall and local teachers and educators, we wrote a grant to the National Science Foundation, and it was not funded the first time or the second time, but it was funded the third time. So
third time's the charm.
Persistence works. And it was kind of a pilot project to take the materials that we had developed in the special education arena and to bring them, make them, scale it up to make them available to all students. And so that's when the term FOSS, the Full Option Science System, came about. And we started working in grades 3, 4, and 5. This was in 1990. We worked with local school districts. That was part of the requirements for the National Science Foundation. And over 3 years, we developed 9 modules. And that's how it began. So it began as a special education program, and then it grew up to be a regular education program to meet the needs of all students. And that's something that has been a part of our foundation from the very beginning, access for all students and for all teachers.
I love how it almost turned that whole thing around. It used to be, well, we'll put special students into their own place and keep them separate. And it turns out that the opposite was 100% true. It's like bringing them in actually opened it up for all the other students too.
Did.
That's wonderful.
It gave us a way to look at how children learn and to provide tools then that made it easier and more. We enriched the opportunities for all students by doing that.
So is that the essential logic model that Johns Hopkins was talking about? Is that
well, part of it. The logic model talks about inputs and outputs and then outcomes. So they were talking about what resources did we develop? What did we say we were going to do? And it's changed a little bit because the educational environment has changed. The language has changed. We've gone from mainstream to full inclusion. There are lots of things, but we wanted to bring a phenomena-based, hands-on active science curriculum. That's what we wanted to develop, hands-on science curriculum. And now we use the term active learning. We wanted it to be flexible. So instead of you start at one place and then you end up at start at X and end at Y, we wanted to develop modules. So there was some flexibility in moving them around, what you teach when. So the sequence doesn't have to be the one, there isn't one way to use the materials. We wanted to develop the actual hardware, that is the physical things that students work with, like developing measurement tools, developing circuit boards. We didn't just go to the supply store and see what was available. We developed it, and we would work with prototype developers who could work with us to get something that was designed specially for a particular investigation. And then we would use it again and again and again. So it wasn't just used in one thing, but it was a tool that students learned how to use and then could apply in a variety of ways. We wanted to develop materials for our learners. So right now we are providing them in various languages so students can work with them to develop English. So English language learners are a really important part of where we're working now. So those are some of the things that we developed for students and for teachers. We developed strategies strategies for how to work with the materials that we provided, how to work with them in the space in the classroom, in the time available in the classroom, how to sequence things, how to distribute materials, how to change the culture in the classroom so that students are working together with each other and with the teacher, developing assessment tools, and developing a plan, a thoughtful plan for professional learning. So just as the students have a progression of learning, teachers also have a progression of learning to learn science, and hopefully then that will spread out and they will apply what they've learned in science to the whole curriculum, so that science is not set apart but becomes a high priority part of the classroom. So we developed some resources. We developed strategies on how to use those resources, provide supports to the teachers and to the students and to the systems that make the whole program work. And then we look for outcomes. What are we hoping that the use of the program will produce? And some of those things are engagement and active learning in the short term, excitement about science in the minds of the students, exposure to diverse role models and scientists, productive participation in collaborative discussion with peers, and a really important one, the use of evidence to develop explanations. So those are some of the things we hope for students in the short term. And then in the long term for students, we hope that it will develop a growth mindset so they have confidence in their ability to work with materials and to work with each other. Their ability to collaborate with peers will become something that they feel confident about. Confidence in scientific communication, both verbally, writing, drawing diagrams, developing the habits of mind of science, and the ability to evaluate information. Again, that use of evidence and to evaluate information based on evidence. And then the ability to apply science knowledge to community and social issues. So we have short-term goals and we have long-term goals. And likewise, we have short-term and long-term goals for the teachers in how they use the materials and how they interact with students.
Well, it's definitely a topic that comes back in all the time with this particular podcast, is really just trying to, elementary teachers may not feel comfortable in science, and FOSS is a great way to do it, but just in general, getting teachers comfortable teaching science and the concepts of science and how they go over all things, math and social studies and English and art, and how science is sort of links all those things together. And that's what it was one of my favorite things about FOSS, but science in general, I think it's a very, very important thing. I was wondering how the development of FOSS over the years, how it's changed. There have been previous versions, previous modules, things that have developed over the years. How has it all led to where we're at now with pathways?
Yes, we're probably in about the 5th or 6th edition every 7 or 8 years, but the program is always evolving, even in between editions it does. And we started out with basically just a teacher guide. We call it the investigation guide for the teachers, and the box of materials, the equipment that makes it possible to implement it. Teachers don't have to go and get their own materials. They have materials that we've tested and know that certain outcomes are possible from them, so that they can feel confident that the materials will work. We started out with that. We didn't even have reading materials at the beginning because we were focused on students, particularly the special ed students, who needed lots of time to work with the first-hand materials. They needed the physical materials to work with. And we felt that all students needed that. So that's where we put our emphasis at the beginning. But then we realized that language is so important, and science is just an excellent way to develop students' language abilities and use of language. we would have them work with what we called notebook sheets. They were individual sheets that had structure at the beginning, and then we removed some of that structure so they had an opportunity to do more of their own kind of recording based on the earlier experiences. So there were two things that became very important. One was reading material, and we call it the FOSS Science Resources Book. It's not a textbook, but it's a way for students to gather information after they've had the firsthand experience so that they can build on that experience. They can think back and they can reflect on their firsthand experience and look at it from a different or from an additional standpoint. And there are some things that we just can't bring into the classroom. So reading diagrams and later online activities allowed us to have more components to, again, bring back to their firsthand experiences. So reading was an important part, and using that for discussion. And then what we used to call a journal then became a science notebook. And that became very, very important. A way for students to record their information, to try to put down some initial ideas and then reflect on those ideas and build. So we're building science knowledge in the same way that scientists build their knowledge, by starting out, exploring some things, asking some questions, going back and reflecting on the earlier experiences and coming up with new experiences. So those two things were extremely important. And then working with teachers to come up with strategies for sense-making discussions. Now that you've done something firsthand, you've collected some data, how do you interpret that data? And how do you develop evidence from the data that allows you to draw conclusions? And that's not a simple thing to do, and teachers are very important in helping kids, not just individually, but as a group, maybe a group of 4 or the whole class, to start to come up with ways to make sense out of data. So sense making is an extremely important thing. And sometimes that's done with a partner or with your collaborative group of 4. And then you bring that to the larger group in the class, listen to other people's ideas, offer your own ideas, and have the flexibility in your mindset to use all of that information to come up with conclusions. And there isn't just one right answer in science, so we have to be ready to accept variations on what kids are finding out. So those are things that became very important in our work, but keeping the idea that we want the materials to be accessible to all students and all teachers.
I love, one of the things I've learned so much about doing this podcast is the power of how science can help teach language and all the writing the kids have to do, and how kids who English isn't their first language, that this is an amazing help because they have to learn how to express things, and they're very excited about it, and they start using the terminology. And that part had never really occurred to me. And I love that about this curriculum, is that it very much notebook based and making kids discuss things. That's awesome. They're just not taking information and being force-fed it, they're figuring it out and having to express it. I love that. That's one of my favorite things. Also, I know, obviously, we talk maybe a little bit about phenomena. It seems to be bigger and bigger. A lot of the videos and all these things are very phenomena-based. How did that come about? Why is that important?
Well, we always had phenomena in FOSS. The phenomena came about from what the kids were working on firsthand. But the idea of putting a slightly different focus on phenomena really came about with the development of the latest standards, the second set of national standards for K-12 science nationally, and then the document, the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards, that guides what should be taught at each grade level, at least in elementary grades. And each state then either accepts those standards or modifies them in some way, since in the United States, education is based on state level rather than national level. But we do have guidance from NGSS. And during the implementation of NGSS, the idea of looking at phenomena became very important. It was described in the framework. After the standards were developed from the framework, this idea of introducing a phenomenon, an event, an observable event to students right off the bat gave them more engagement and agency in trying to figure things out so they could explain that phenomenon. And that's what we've in Pathways have tried to do. The next step is to come up with engaging phenomena, observable events or a problem related to something that they observe, that they can then figure out what it is that they want to explore, how they want to go about doing that, and then build understanding over time. So an investigation might last for 2 weeks or longer. So it's not just from one experience, but it's from a series, a sequence, a thoughtful sequence of experiences that they build their understanding so that they can explain that phenomena. So part of it is engagement. Part of it is building that mindset of how science works and how you collect data and then try to pull from the data evidence that you can then use to make a claim, to draw conclusions.
We've talked a lot about the past here. You've been doing this for over 45 years, and you've laid this amazing foundation. I mean, it's an amazing legacy. I was wondering what you hope for the future of FOSS, but also of science education in general. This topic sort of comes up every now and then. We try to stay away from anything overtly political, but the world of just, skepticism about science or how important science needs to be, how it often is pushed to the side for social studies and math scores, but how important science is. What do you want the future for FOSS and for science in general to be?
Well, I can only speak at the elementary level right now, but the time that students and teachers have to engage in exploring the designed and natural world is really important. And there just doesn't seem to be enough time in the school day to do that. And since in the last 4 or 5 years, really from the onset of the pandemic, there was a great decline in the use of science programs in schools. And we're just now starting to rebuild that. The science, reading and math seem to take up the entire school day with very little time left for other things. And one of my hopes is that science becomes a priority, and so that students have that opportunity, and that the divisions between math and science are broken down a little bit so that they see that by the use of the strategies used in science, students will improve their ability to get information from the printed word. They will improve their ability to write. They will be more excited about using these other tools to find out more about something that they're doing in science. So we need to provide more time for science at the elementary level. We need to provide more support and just raise the importance of science in the curriculum of students. That's what I hope the future brings.
You would think that math and science would go hand in hand because science is the practical application of math. Because I think a lot of students are like, when am I ever going to use this? Oh, right here. Here's where I'm going to use this. You would think that we'd embrace that. Here, this practical. It's really being used.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question, just in the sense of when you were talking about doing this, starting in the 1970s. I wanted to talk a little bit about women in science, and you are obviously you could be considered, the word pioneer is not too much to say. You're creating a science education system in the 70s as a woman in science. How have you seen that change over the years? I think it's improved a lot, obviously, but it's still something that we are dealing with, women in STEM, trying to get more women involved in STEM. And you've been there from the start. I was just wondering if you talk a little bit about maybe some of the early obstacles, but how you've seen it change and what your hope for the future is.
Well, when I first came to the Lawrence Hall of Science, there was another project here at the Hall called the Equals Project. And its goal was to encourage young girls in math. And between that project and the work that we were doing in science, there was a group around the Bay Area that started a number of conferences for girls in math and science. We get together on a Saturday. Girls of all ages would come, and there were activities that they could become involved with, and they would get to meet women that were either working in math or science, and it was these conferences started. So that's how I kind of got involved with the idea of women in science and math. And those have just blossomed. Now I think there are many, many more opportunities. I think girls have taken advantage of that. We have a career database as part of the FOSS Web online activities, where students can go and find out about people who are involved as scientists. And we add to that all the time. And the number of women, I think, that are added outnumber the men in some ways, or maybe we're looking for them. But and here at Berkeley, that's certainly the case. So I think it's expanded greatly. I'm sure there are still some hurdles that women have to overcome, but it's changed, I think, drastically, both in education and in the STEM fields over that period of time.
Anecdotally, I personally feel that social media has really helped a ton, because I follow a bunch of science people on Instagram, and I'd say 80% of them are women. And, it's wonderful. I just think maybe they're more approachable, but it's just like they're providing all of this wonderful, inspiration for the next generation of kids. I'm hoping that this now exponentially gets bigger, because it's literally in their faces on their phones all the time. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So after we talked to Drs. Reid and Ross about the Johns Hopkins, it's a Tier 4 badge, and there are tiers above it. What is FOSS doing to maybe move up in those tiers? What kind of research is being done, and what is it, the kind of thing that you're going to need?
I thought they did a great job describing the various tiers, and what Tier 4, which has to do with instructional design, they were looking at whether the objectives made sense, whether the sequence made sense, and the support was provided. And it had nothing to do with how the material was used in the classroom. They were looking at just whether it met industry standards for designing curriculum. And that part of that was that outside research would be done to look at its effectiveness. And we are in the process of doing that. It takes time, and it takes resources, and it takes implementation of the materials. So a new project has to be in the classroom for a while. And then it's not really something that we can do, but we can add other outside researchers to join with us and to look at the effectiveness. And that's where you can then start doing some case studies, and then move up from Tier 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, where you have the gold standard experimental design. But all of that takes resources, and we are applying for funds from the Department of Education and the National Science Foundation to do some of those initial studies. We're looking at the outcomes and proposing to work with certain groups. So right now we have a project proposal pending that would look at the effect of the program on multilingual learners, so English language learners, and how the materials improve their ability to demonstrate their growth in English language. So those are the kinds of things that we are going to be trying to do, but they take time and resources.
I've worked for FOSS on and off for a long, long time. I've always loved the program. And Linda, it is so amazing to get to talk to you about the history of it. So I just wanted to thank you so much for being here and for all you've done for elementary science over your career. It's Time for Science is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lippman and Tom Racine, and is sponsored by School Specialty and FOSS, the full option science system, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, UC Berkeley. Be sure to check out FOSS on Facebook and Instagram.